So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Patrick Ahern, and I'm a member of the SAKI TTA team, and I will be your Zoom host today. Before we get started, I'm going to go over a few housekeeping items for you. Please note that your microphone and web camera are automatically muted as you join today. If technical support is needed, please let us know through the chat window or by emailing sakittta@rti.org. If you have any questions regarding today's material, please type them into the chat or Q&A window at any time. And you may also click the raise hand button to let us know you'd like to unmute and ask your question out loud. We will archive this webinar within a few business days, and we'll also send out an email announcement to all who have registered. This announcement will also include a PDF copy of today's presentation. You can view all of our archived webinars on the SAKI TTA website under the webinars section. So at this point, I'll turn things over to Angela Williamson to introduce today's session. Thank you.
Thanks, Patrick, and hi, everyone. Thanks for joining today. For those of you who don't know me, I am the Forensics Unit Supervisor at BJA. I'm really excited to have this presentation today because I know familial DNA searching, one, is a requirement that we ask of our grantees for the applicable grant programs. Two, I know it's not an easy ask, and I know a lot of you are struggling with this, and Trampus and Gary are going to present you a really successful model for how they've been able to implement it in Texas. Just a little bit of context on why we do ask that our grantees do familial DNA searches. There are two main reasons. One is that traditionally federal grant money was only to be used for DNA that could go into governmental databases. We obviously allow FGG now, which is fantastic, and that's an exception to the rule. And one of the ways that we do that and make exceptions is that we do prove to the people that give us the money to give to you is that we're doing everything we can possible to populate CODIS and governmental databases first. So that's why familial DNA is a requirement, because you're utilizing the data, the DNA that you have at your state level. And the other reason is that I think most of you realize by now that the populations in the genealogy databases are typically very different to that in CODIS and your state level of CODIS. So basically, to make it really simple, if you're trying to find someone, liken it to going fishing, you've got a better success of catching a fish if you have access to two lakes than just one. And that is really the fundamental reason on why we are definitely mandating that familial searching, if legal, if permissible in your state, is done on cases. We have a lot of time for Q&A at the end where we can talk about when we make exceptions and the future of this requirement. But with that, I'm just going to hand over to Texas Ranger Trampus Gooding, who is heading up a lot of this work for their SAKI site, and is here to share his experience with his lab partner, Gary Molina. Take it away, Trampus.
Thank you, Doc. Next slide. Okay, so this is the disclaimers that normally are associated when we're presenting for DOJ, BJA. See there at the bottom there, points of view, opinions of this document are those of the author and do not necessarily represent the official position and policies of the U.S. Department of Justice. Pretty much, DOJ is not responsible for anything that I say or people I offend. So that's the disclaimer. This other one here, this is additional one, because we're going to talk about a few cases at the end, some success stories. And so the disclaimer is that the people that we talk about, we have to presume that they're innocent until proven guilty. All right, so I'm Trampus Gooding. I'm a staff lieutenant with the Texas Rangers. Been a ranger for about 18 years. Been in law enforcement 29. Last 3 years, I've been involved with the SAKI grant as the site coordinator, investigation coordinator. And I work with Mr. Gary Molina, who's with CODIS. Go ahead, Gary.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Gary Molina. I am the CODIS program manager for the state of Texas. And in that role, I act as the state CODIS administrator for Texas. I am a graduate of University of Texas at Austin, and I've been employed with DPS for 30 years. I just hit 30 years in October, and I'm still here, still kicking. Next slide, please. So most of you guys already know the difference between familial searching and genetic genealogy. Familial searching is the intentional search of the database, in this particular case, CODIS database, looking for close biological relatives. Next slide. We do our searches at the state level. So we search the targeted profile against all the offenders and arrestees in our ESDIS, at the ESDIS level. We do search the arrestees as well as the offenders, convicted offenders. And when we find a candidate, or we will find several candidates, we will perform YSTR testing on those to confirm a possible paternal relationship. Now, this is different than a partial match because a familial search is an intentional search, whereas a partial match is one that's discovered during a regularly scheduled search. And we have a different protocol for releasing information in the event of a partial match. Now, that's different from forensic genetic genealogy because in those cases, law enforcement used DNA analysis combined with traditional genealogy research to generate those investigative leads. And to touch back on what Angela had mentioned earlier about phishing, I actually use a phishing analogy with my investigators when we talk about the difference between familial searching and genetic genealogy. I explained that familial searching is like fishing with a hook, and genetic genealogy is like fishing with a net. When you're doing that familial searching, you're looking for that one candidate. Most times, it's one candidate that has a matching YSTR profile that might confirm a paternal relationship between the forensic evidence and the offender that we found. When you're doing forensic genetic genealogy, you're like fishing with a net because you're finding a lot of possible candidates that might be related, whether they be first level relationship or a third cousin. So you're actually widening that search, but both of them are very important in developing investigative leads. Next slide, please. So there are some considerations that Angela spoke about. They do ask that you adhere to the interim policy on FGG. And in addition to that, the familial searching, if it's allowed in your state, I, as a designated lab official, have to advise any agency wanting to use grants for a genetic genealogy that there is the availability of other DNA technologies and techniques that might be an alternative to FGG before we proceed on to that. Next slide, please. So I'm going to give you guys a little history on how we developed our program, what our challenges were when we developed the program, and what challenges still remain today. Next slide, please. Okay, I apologize, that slide's a little out of order. These are the actual laboratories. Oh no, there we go. We were actually the third state in the nation to implement a familial searching program. We relied a lot on California's model, and we also went touch base with Colorado. But currently, as far as I know, these are the 17 states that are currently doing familial searching. With the exception on this list of Michigan. Michigan has since ceased their familial search program. And then New York had due to a legal court decision, they had ceased operations because it had not been approved by the legislature. If there are any others that are not on this list, please reach out to me and let me know. I'd love to complete this list with anyone that's currently doing familial searching. Next slide, please. So in Texas, we have a total of 17 laboratories that we provide services for. 10 of those laboratories are DPS labs, Department of Public Safety labs, and 7 of them are non-DPS labs. and they're spread out throughout the state. Aside from those laboratories, since we are the state lab, we are required to provide services to any law enforcement agency in the state of Texas. Next slide, please. So our program was actually initiated in 2010. We were asked at the request of the director to look into familial searching. At that time, there was a serial rapist that was attacking elderly women, and these were in rural areas and not necessarily concentrated in one particular area. So it was a very unique case in that these elderly women who lived alone were spread out over a certain part of Texas, and they had no leads. So the director, very concerned about the safety of these women, safety of Texas, civilians, asked us to look into the possibility of creating a familial search program. So one of the first things that we looked at were, what if we were to implement this case, what types of cases would we do? And we narrowed it down to unsolved homicides, sexual assaults, and other violent crimes that had a significant public safety concern. For example, we did a familial search on a series of bank robberies that escalated with each event. So it started out as just someone walking in, claiming they had a gun, robbed the bank, until it eventually led up to a robbery in which an armed guard was injured with a firearm. So that would be an example of the third one. So next slide, please. So there were a lot of considerations that we had to look at in addressing our director's request. And first of all, we had to determine whether or not it was even allowable based on our Texas statute, or if it was prohibited. So we reached out to our OGC, and based on the Texas database statute, we asked if they could make an interpretation or if we needed to bump it up to the Attorney General's office for an opinion. It was our OGC's opinion, based on the wording of our statute, that we were indeed allowed, based on the wording of our statute, to use the database for familial searching. So that was the first hurdle we had to climb. And then we had to decide, well, how do we even start thinking about doing a familial search program? So our laboratory, luckily, had a lot of contacts. We do a lot of work, and we are very closely related to the University of North Texas. They have provided DPS with a lot of kinship analysis in cases. So we had them as a resource to look at. And we also had a very good relationship with Cal DOJ. And they had already been performing familial searching for a while. And so we really relied on those two entities because of the relationship that had already been developed between DPS and those entities. Next slide, please. So once we developed and reached out to those agencies, some of the things that we looked at were some training in kinship analysis, and that's provided through the California Criminalist Institute. And they have a class taught by some well-respected folks out in California. Stephen Myers is one of them. Brian Harmon is another. So we were fortunate enough to send some employees out to that institute and to take that class. When we were looking at what type of software we needed, it just so happened that the University of North Texas had developed a portion of their MPKIN software to perform familial searching. So we kind of lucked out. We reached out to these folks, and they had a solution for us. Since that time, we have validated the CODA software to do the familial searching for us now. So we started with the UNT software. We moved to the CODA software, which is what we currently use. So then we had to decide, well, what are we going to need for validation purposes? So through our research, and because we had some resources within our prison system, we were actually able to identify database samples that were already in CODIS that were related. we were able to identify brothers and father-son relationships. So we used those profiles that were already in CODIS for some of our testing. We also gathered samples from family members of our staff. And then we had to develop a plan for validation of YSTRs. So that was a little, difficult, but we were able to get that done. And we also used the NIST standard reference family data in order to do some of our verification testing. Next slide, please. So in developing a familial search program, if your laboratory does not have one right now, there are some things that are not as much of a concern anymore as there were back in the past when we started. Familial searching is now widely accepted. Privacy concerns are really not an issue if the program is performed responsibly, such as we have certain criteria that must be met prior to agreeing to do a familial search, and that's based on the offense of the case that we're doing, the confidence that we have in the profile, and the completeness of that profile. And the best thing for those of you on this call is that there's no need to reinvent the wheel. As I showed earlier, there are 17 other states that you could reach out to for guidance and help and suggestions and bouncing questions off. That was a big obstacle for us when we started this program because we just didn't even know where to start. And now there are a number of states that can offer you some advice and perhaps share their validation with you. Things that we still have that are a concern are resources, and that's both financial and staff related. We have limited number of staff. We're fortunate to have a fairly large staff. We have 30 folks here in our laboratory, but that includes management and supervisors. But there's still a financial burden that we have to deal with, and we'll touch base on that shortly. And then last but not least, the validation of YSTR testing for database labs. I was fortunate at the time to have two great minds working on this project. One of them is our current CODIS program coordinator, Chris Pawanka, and you will have his contact information later. And our technical leader at the time was Sandy Schaefer. And the two of them did a wonderful job in our validation of not just the familial searching of a profile, but also the validation of YSTR testing. So I'm eternally grateful to both of those folks for working on this. Next slide, please. So it is a free resource to all law enforcement agencies as part of our regular services. Our priority is still focused on testing and uploading qualified individuals into CODIS. So we had to find a way that we could implement familial searching while continuing to process regular samples, which we are mandated to do by law. And as you can see, prior to the SAKI grant, we were only averaging about 5 searches a year. That was from 2010 to 2019. And they were mostly performed by one analyst. And when I say one analyst, that is the person who actually did the physical testing of the samples. We have Chris Pawanka, who I spoke of earlier. He's the one that actually runs the search. He develops a candidate list. There are usually, we run about anywhere from 100 to 175 samples from that list. We will retest the STRs for those samples, as well as perform YSTR testing on those samples. And that testing is actually done by one match verification analyst, and that was from 2010 to 2019. This person was already responsible for doing match verifications on CODIS hits, so we thought it would be convenient for her to do the familial searching testing also at that time. But once Trampus got the SAKI grant from 2020 to 2022, we've averaged about 15 searches a year. And as you can imagine, that created a burden on our resources, our both staff and budget-wise. One of the things that we looked at when we were doing familial searches and match verifications, we realized the potential benefit of running YSTRs on any sample that we were already performing match verification on. So not only are we doing Y testing on our familial search candidates, we're also extending that testing to any time we pull a sample to do a match verification. Next slide. So we had to find ways to alleviate the burden that was placed on us, not eliminate, but alleviate. So we're always going to have those burdens unless we were able to fund an entire staff dedicated strictly to familial searching. Those burdens are always going to be there. So what could we do to help alleviate some of these burdens? We changed our match verification process in familial search to include more scientists. So as I mentioned earlier, at the time, we only had one person doing both match verifications and familial searches. Because of that burden, we decided to change our process, and we now have two folks primarily doing familial searching, and then match verification has moved into a system where we have all of our scientists eligible to work on those. They go into our regular process. So any scientist working on offender samples will be available to work on those match verifications, and then we have two dedicated scientists to do familial searching. The other thing we were able to do is we kindly asked Trampus for money. So we looked at the SAKI funds and we asked, can we do overtime? So we were able to use those funds for overtime to do these searches. Trampus was also able to purchase some amplification kits. There was a time during the end of a fiscal year where we were having some budgetary issues and were unable to purchase additional kits to complete familial searches. So we were able to use some of those funds for that purpose. And then we were able to work on a reimbursement process through the Texas Rangers so that any familial search that was part of their SAKI grant, we could invoice them the cost of our supplies and then get reimbursed into our regular budget. So that helped out a lot. Two of the other things that helped us in this process were that we had already begun validating the coded software to perform familial searches. And we also validated a direct AMP with the YFiler Plus kit. So what we do now is that we are able to punch into two plates, one for direct AMP of YFiler Plus and one directly for the testing of Global Filer Express. And those were already in the works prior to the SAKI grant. So those were two things that we had already started, but they have helped tremendously in getting through the requests that we have for SAKI. Next slide. I'm going to turn it over to Trampus here. Oh wait, there's one last slide. So these are the results of the searching that we've done. As you can see, but from 2010 to 2019, we had 31 cases for a total of 46 searches. We will search a profile a second time. If the first time is unsuccessful, we will accept a request to redo that search a year after the initial search. So our thinking is that after a year, there will be more offenders in the database that were not searched the first time. And also it allows some that were lower on the ranking list, those will move up and we can retest those samples. In that time between 2010 and 2019, we were able to aid 5 cold cases, with a success rate of about 16%. Nationally, we're seeing about a 10% success rate. We're a little bit above that. and that translates into an 11% search rate. So as I say, some of these cases have been searched multiple times, so that's the difference in the percentage there. But since that time, we've searched 27 cases for a total of 33 searches, and we were able to, again, aid 5 unsolved cases. So our success rate went up a little bit, not by much, but a little bit. And we've also continued to do non-SAKI cases. So the cases that we do for Trampus usually have some type of sexual assault component to them. So that excludes homicides. So we still have homicides and those other violent crimes that we get requests to do searches on. And if you'll hit the button, I think there's a graphic here, you'll notice that the success rate is a little bit higher for those non-SAKI cases, but we attribute that just to the number of searches we've done. We expect that number to go down once we've searched more cases. So that is the success that we've seen using familial search with SAKI, and I'm going to turn it over to Trampus here. Thank you.
Thank you, Gary. So I'm going to talk about the law enforcement side of this. My perception, I'm not a forensic scientist, so what my knowledge, my experience, it's hands-on, and everything that I've learned from doing familial searches, it's talking with Gary and talking with forensic scientists. So you got to remember too that DOJ's policy, interim policy, is that we're required to do familial searches before we move to genetic genealogy. And that policy is there for us for a reason, is to protect us. And like anything else, we can't do a familial search unless all leads are exhausted with the investigation. And that means ruling out any consensual partners and stuff like that. Following up all leads, there's nothing else to do. We're at a dead end. So then we can do a familial search. And then after that, you need to go to genetic genealogy. So to me, it's very important that we follow that policy, because there's agencies, not agencies, there are groups and people out there that are trying to take this technique, this science, take it away from law enforcement because they think we're cheating, and they don't want us using it because it's working. So keep that in mind, that, hey, this familial search stuff, it's tough, it's expensive, but there's a need for it. And if we do it correctly, everybody does it correctly, we won't lose this capability. So getting into the familial searches, when you're wanting to do one, you're going to have to have that YSTR profile. You got to have the STR, and it has to be pretty much full profile. Then you have to have the YSTR profile to complete it. And then once your forensic labs do that testing, then it's up to law enforcement to submit the request memos. And you don't call up the CODIS lab and say, hey, I want to do a familial search. What you do a request memo that outlines the case. It gives all the details, it explains the synopsis, all leads are exhausted, and that you're requesting a familial search on that particular specimen ID that's in CODIS. Then you make that request, and it's addressed to Gary. And but you also need a memo from the district attorney's office saying that, hey, I support the law enforcement. If y'all like to request a familial search, if we find any leads, then we're going to follow up on them. Now, again, this is just for Texas. I don't know what these other states are doing out there, or whatever the requirements are, but these are our requirements. So once you get your law enforcement memo and your DA's memo, you send it back to the forensic scientist who's doing the casework, and they put together the packet. They put together the allele table, the electrophorograms, all the lab reports, your memos, and any other requirements that they have, and then they send that to Gary's group, and Gary and his team review it and approve it or disapprove it. There may be times where they have asked a few more questions. Hey, can you explain this? about this case, it's not in there, or it might be a serial offender case, and we're mentioning two of the cases, but there's a third case that we didn't mention, so we might have to tweak it a little bit. But they're good at that, making sure they have all the information before they proceed. Once it gets approved, then they'll start their process of testing it. So going to the lab process, you're looking at 13 to 20 loci for STR. And then, you have to have pretty much a full STR profile. It can be sometimes just one or two loci missing, then it will still be approved, but that's up to Gary's team. YSTR, same thing. You got to have a full profile. If you have a low partial profile, it's probably not going to work. At least 13 CODIS core loci. And you also got to also remember that the databases that we're searching, there's a lot of known offender profiles in there, but they were done with older kits. They're not with the newer kits, the 24-plex, the one with the expanded loci. So sometimes Gary's team will take that known offender and your evidence is tested with newer kits, so they have to go back and retest that known offender with STR and YSTR. That's why it's so expensive. It takes about 60 man hours to do the CODIS familial searches. And then remember that the SAKI grant allows for overtime for that. So out of that 60 man hours, if we need to complete those cases with overtime, the SAKI funds can reimburse that, can pay for that. And so if you look at the total, the cost and the man hours, you're looking about $13,000, $14,000 per familial search. Okay, so let's talk about the results. All right, so here in Texas, we have over 1 million offenders in that in our CODIS database, known offenders. And so when they do the familial search, it'll produce a candidate list. And that candidate list here can be 1,000 to 2,000 possibilities. Now, the better candidates are in the top. They're up there by ranking. Some algorithm ranks them with higher probabilities of being related. And so we can't test, or Gary's team, they can't test all 1,000 to 2,000 offenders. I mean, that is just way too much. So what they'll do is pull off the top 150 to 250 from that list, and look at those known offenders and see if they need to update their STR profile. See if they have a YSTR profile already in file. If not, then they'll perform that testing. And then sometimes that's where the time to do all that testing, that's where it was in the past, it created a lot of delays for us. Another thing here in Texas, and I'm not too sure about the other familial sites or other states with familial search capabilities, is that we can only do one familial search per case per year. So on you submit a case, you have it tested, familial search, you didn't get any results, then you get that back, a year goes by, then you can make another request. The good thing about that request here in Texas is just by an email. All we do is send Gary's team an email a year later and say, hey, we'd like another familial search performed on this test. And they'll do it. We already have the memos in place, so right away they can get started on it. Now, when they do that second familial search, they'll run that candidate list again, and the offenders that are still on there from the 150 to 250, they don't have to test those anymore. They go further down the list. And that's where sometimes you'll find there's been a few cases where our unknown offender relative was further down on that list, would have been identified in year 3, or he was identified in a subsequent familial search. So don't just throw out when you get that first one back and it says no matches resulted. That's not the end of it. There's more down there. You're just going to have to wait and do that for next year. Next slide, please. Delays. like any state department, or even the locals and everything like that, local agencies, you're going to have delays when you're trying to obtain materials, and you have to go through your procurement process. The procurement process is the kind of the biggest delay with any of these grants that we're dealing with, because you have to go through that process, and our process for a contract takes about a year. And so you got to get started on it. With us requesting these familial searches and requesting more of them, our lab wasn't planned, that they weren't prepared for the amount of familial searches that were coming in. And so the materials were used up, and so they needed more materials. Well, they have to go through the procurement process. They got to do even a spot purchase takes about 2 months, and so there's always a delay in that. Also, in the beginning, we had when they were doing 5 per year, our turnaround time was 6 months, so that was delaying us on having familial searches completed. Luckily, when Gary revamped their system, that time went down tremendously. That's right. So yes, so when the first time they ran out of, I believe it was global fiber, so it was STR kits. So we were going to have to wait, and actually, the vendor lab for the CODIS, they decided not to renew their contract. But what anything on CODIS, the vendor, they decided like, hey, we don't want to give you this material at this price anymore, so we're not renewing our contract. Well, that caused the CODIS lab to have to start all over again, the procurement process, to try to get the materials, and that's when we went and got permission through BJA, DOJ to go ahead and purchase one of these global fiber kits, STR, to help the familial surgeons get moving again. So when Gary and them revamped their system, we went from 6 months to 1 month. And so it probably takes still, from the time that we make the request to our lab to submit the familial search, that'll take a couple of weeks, depending on how busy that forensic scientist is. And then it'll take a couple of weeks for approval process, and then it'll take about a month of testing. So it's still a couple month process, but just the testing itself is gone down tremendously, which is awesome, helps us out. And what they're doing, 4 to 5 surgeries per month. Now, one of the things that we're going to be, that's coming up, I know it's going to be an issue coming up, is that we have other SAKI sites here in Texas that have to do the same thing. And right now they have not made the amount of requests that we're doing here with the Rangers, but there's a chance, propensity that we're going to have several agencies making a lot of familial search requests. And so how are we going to address that issue? So that's something that we're talking about and looking into the future, trying to plan ahead. Next slide, please. Right, so these are our numbers for the familial searches, which abbreviated FS. 13 was done in 2020 request, and there's only 6, so it showed you the delay. And then 2021, there was 9, and that's when they that summer they were revamping their equipment and the validation process and validating the Wi-Fi kits. So there was still a little bit of delay, and then some of the ones they completed that year were from the previous year. And then, of course, 2022, you see that we're rocking along. Now, the number's 36. I think we've done 37 requests. 34 have been completed now. 2 were stopped because 1, we identified a possible suspect, so there's no reason to do a familial search. So we're working on getting that guy's DNA. And another one, the agency was able to solve the case right as the familial search started. So we stopped that one. And then right now we have 1 in the queue. But, so this, these numbers right here, it's, they've already changed since we created this PowerPoint, but the cost for the materials, we're looking at on an average of $9,570. Actually, that has gone up to over $10,000 with the cost of inflation. Thank you very much. And then the man hours, the 60 man hours, that's about $3,100. So for 32 familial searches, it's cost the lab $405,000. Materials alone for those is $306. And so we're reimbursing the laboratory for that through with the use of the SAKI funds. There in May, the bottom number there is, it says 66,000. That's already changed. We're at 94,000 something, and it's only increasing. Next slide. Something to think about though. I mean, so we're talking about the cost of familial searches. I wanted to throw this in here. This is from the American Journal of Preventive Medicine. This is the cost of a to the society. This is the average cost of a sexual assault to society, not including the mental anguish and everything that happens to the victim. But what we're doing in the cost of these familial searches is just like dropping the bucket for what's happening with these sexual assaults. And if we can, you know, the ones that we're looking at, they've already occurred, but our job, if we can prevent it, then we're making some headway. So just keep that in mind. I mean, there's people say that, yeah, it's cost a lot, but there's other costs out there that's costing us a lot more. Okay, so these are a couple of success stories. This fine gentleman here, he 7 rapes. This is San Antonio area. You can tell he's an outstanding citizen. I mean, he just looks like he's just helping out with society and his community. He 7 rapes, which is kind of interesting about this one though, is that when we did the familial search, it hit to, and I don't know if y'all remember this, but in 2000 we had 7 inmates escape from prison down in South Texas. And so they fled up and went up north. They stopped off in the Dallas area and killed a police officer in one of the communities up there and continued on to Colorado. They got caught. Well, his brother, he was executed in 2018, but his DNA is still in the system. And so it hit to the Texas 7 escapee. We researched him, tried to find out all his family. We found out Michael Anthony Garcia. He was living in the area during, still lives in the area from 2006, 2016. So he became our target, our priority. Found out that he had outstanding traffic warrants. He was stopped, arrested. He was given a bottle of water while his vehicle was being processed and getting towed. And he drank the water and then threw it on the ground. We got it collected, sent off for DNA testing, and boom, it matched. They gave us probable cause to go back and get his DNA directly from him, arrest him for the assaults, interview him. Of course, he lowered that. Excellent. This is another one from the Dallas area on 4 sexual assaults. I don't have his name on there just because it's pending indictment, but it did hit just brothers, 2 brothers who were in CODIS. So you can tell that's an outstanding family out there. Now they're going to be 3 of them in CODIS. Next slide. This guy here, I guess he thought he wanted to commit a sexual assault. So in 2005, he decided to break into a mobile home. And we know that he was watching the person, and he knew that she lived in there along with a child. So he takes off a window unit on the far end, window AC unit, climbs through, proceeds to the house, goes to the kitchen, grabs a knife, and then goes to the back bedroom. He gets on top of the victim. He's going to sexually assault her. He picked the wrong girl. She fought back. She took the knife away from him. And in the process of that, he cut himself. he got up and fled, and he smeared some blood on a baby swing as his on his exit. So that was in CODIS, no hits. We came along, did the familial search. It hit to a younger guy that this was actually one of our first ones that, you know, we look at father-son relationships and then possible brothers. Well, this hit to a nephew. So this is, I believe this is the first one that hit to an uncle nephew. Anyways, the sheriff, we researched the younger guy and found this uncle living up there. He'd been in the area at the time and wasn't too far away from it this last year. So he was working at a restaurant. The sheriff went in there to eat at the restaurant and was waiting for him to discard some evidence. And sure enough, he was eating there, took a break. The suspect, Jesse, did, took a break and was eating lunch and then got up and went and discarded his plate and fork. And the sheriff went over and collected it and got it tested and it matched. He has since, he confessed to this, and so he's still in county jail. This one here, this is out of the Houston area in Louisiana. So he did several in Houston and one in Baton Rouge. We did to a brother. When we're researching we couldn't find him being related to the brother. But I got on Facebook and was going through some of the family members' Facebook page, and they had rest in peace Eddie Bradley, and it was 2021. So I mean, they had a family member that became deceased, so we researched him, and sure enough, it was a brother. So he died from a motorcycle accident in 2021, but in 2019, he was arrested for DWI second and refused to give a breast specimen. But luckily the investigating officer obtained a warrant and got a blood specimen for his BAC, for blood alcohol content. They submitted to the laboratory and it was never tested. And so when I found that out, we called the lab, contacted them. This is this, we still have it. So with him being deceased, we went ahead and had it submitted and it matched. Next slide. Okay, so this is the kind of the comparison between familial DNA searching and forensic genetic genealogy. So you can see there are 34 cases completed on familial searches, 5 leads, 4 suspects identified, 3 arrested, and 1 deceased, and then 1 is being pursued right now. We think it's going to be another uncle, nephew. It hit to a nephew that was in CODIS, and we're in the process of collecting his DNA covertly. Looking at genealogy, so we submitted 34 samples, but 25 have been completed. And now those 25, 8 investigative leads. So 8 suspects identified. We still got 1 pending indictment. And then there's 17 cases that are still being target tested. So we still have not identified a true suspect or a true lead. So, but we're working with the family members and trying to get their family trees back. You can see the FTG is probably a little higher, a little better success rate, but in reality, you know, this effort is to get these guys identified, get them arrested, indicted, get some justice for the victims and their families. But individually, yeah, FTGs may be pushing it, but it's combined together. This both of these. This is a great tool for motor searches and FTG too. So, next slide. Okay, so these are the resources that we talked about today for some reading material on familial searches. The scientific working group. There's a publication there on that. DOJ's interim policy, there's the location for that. read that and please adhere to that. Let's not lose this capability from doing familial searches, from doing genetic genealogy. Just like anything else, these rules are in place to help us. And of course, the last thing there is DPS's standard operating procedures on partial matches and familial searches. And I think that's the last slide for me. Here's the contact information. Okay. Yeah, so here's our contact. There's Gary's and my contact. And then I believe Dr. Angela Williamson wanted to say some additional information.
Thank you, Trappist and Gary. You can stay on camera, gentlemen, because now we'll open the floor for Q&A from our audience.
I want to give
Angela,
a
I'm
shout
not.
out to Steve O'Cam with Utah DPS. So they've gone through their procurement process, and so they're up and running and doing the familial searches and genetic genealogy also.
So I did see, it looks like we have a couple questions. Christiana asked, does Texas ever run familiar searches for other states?
That's a great question. We will if there is a nexus to the state. So we recently performed familial search for another state that had a case-to-case code is hit between their state and our state. We actually performed in conjunction with genetic genealogy, a familial search out of Colorado. The genetic genealogy had a lot of information, but they had kind of hit a dead end. But everything was pointing to a relationship to a family in Texas. So they asked us to perform familial searching for them. And we were able to provide information to a relative that they had not been aware of. So that helped that particular case. So yes, we will. There just needs to be some type of like I said, some type of connection to the state of Texas, and feel free to submit any request to us, and we can move forward from there.
In addition, we're actually requesting a familial search to Florida that Gary helped us coordinate on 3 rapes, 2 in Texas and 1 in Florida. The victim in Florida, however, she committed suicide due to the rape. And so they don't have a case to do, but we're making the familial search request for our cases to Florida, and hopefully we can find somebody. And if we don't have any success there, then we'll be able to get Florida's data and do the familiar search request to Texas, to Gary's team.
Yeah, in that particular case, the profile in Florida is actually more suitable for familial searching than the 2 we have here in Texas. So we're grateful to Florida for looking into the possibility of doing that search for us.
Okay, we have one more question for Gary. How do you handle female candidates that are returned?
Thanks, Courtney. It's good to see you attend. We actually we just recently decided that if both the forensic profile and the offender profile have the expanded loci, if they reach a certain degree of relatedness, then we would release that information with the caveat that we could not provide additional information through YSTR testing. And so we will put a lot of disclaimers in there if that's the case. Now, we will only do that if it reaches a certain amount of relatedness, and if it is a full profile with the expanded loci. We will not release any information if it is only a 13 original CODIS core profile. We have not had an opportunity to release a name yet because we have yet to have a female profile reach that level of confidence for us.
Patrick, can you just advance the slides? There's one more. Just while you're taking your time to think about other questions, I just wanted to reiterate how SAKI funds can be used to support familial DNA searching. So like anything with our grant programs, if we ask you to do something, we allow you to use the grant funds to do it. Trampus and Gary touched on this a little bit. So you can use your SAKI funds for overtime for laboratory personnel. That could be to run the searches, evaluate potential familial matches, pull and profile the samples for YSTRs. The YSTR testing to evaluate potential familial matches. You can purchase kits and reagents like Texas DPS does under SAKI. You can use your money for profiling, or you can choose to outsource this work to a vendor lab if that helps you expedite the process. That call is up to you. And then you can use your SAKI funds for investigative activities like Trampus does that are associated with the location, collection, and analysis of suspect DNA samples for comparison and identification of the actual perpetrator. And one of the favorite things that we like to support, exhumations. If the suspect is deceased, you can use your SAKI funding for exhumations. And Texas just did one for a case that was actually out of Colorado, where the two states worked together and the offender was deceased in Texas, and SAKI funds were used for that exhumation. So that is allowable as well.
Okay, so if there are any last minute questions at this time, please type those into the chat or Q&A. Also, we're going to launch our poll questions. So if everyone could take a moment to answer the poll questions, we would really appreciate your feedback. We'll give everyone a minute or so to answer these questions. And just a reminder, we will archive this webinar within a few days, and we'll send out an email announcement to all who registered, and this will include a PDF of the presentation. So maybe at this point, I'll turn things back over to our presenters to see if they have any final comments.
Thank you, Patrick. I would just like to say, I know that for those states who don't do familial searching, it seems like a very difficult task to undertake. There were some difficulties, but we have a very robust program that we're very proud of. And I want to just reiterate that the amount of testing that we do in Texas is probably not going to be seen by your state, because we have a lot more people, a lot more crime than probably most of the folks on here. So just keep that in mind. And we're always here to answer any questions you guys might have. So thank you for attending today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Gary. Trampus, any parting words of wisdom from your perspective using this technology?
Well, I just want to thank you to Dr. Angela and DOJ, BJA, and RTI. They're helping us out. I mean, this is a long term. There's a lot to it. And anytime you have any questions on familial searches or anything like that, if you can't get answers, to somebody that reach out to them. They'll walk you through it. I think they've helped us out tremendously, walking us through this process, kind of giving us an idea of what we can do, what we can't do. Then also with familiar searches, or even with this effort, just remember why we're doing this. We're doing this for the victims. So even though certain things seem overwhelming, or they're a hassle, they're a burden, just remember you're doing this for the victims and the victims' family. Don't forget that. Thanks.
Thank you, Trampus. And we have one more question that just came in. I think we have time to answer.
Yes, so, oh, go ahead.
So the question is, how long does a case have to be in familial searching phase before the decision is made to advance to FGG? So we will perform one familial search, and we will base that search on the number of offenders that are currently in the database at the time of the search. So once that search is completed, we produce our candidate list, we perform YSTR testing on that candidate list, and if there are no YSTR matches, at that point, we will instruct Krampus and the investigators of the case that familial search did not produce any investigative leads, and they're free to move on to genetic genealogy. Krampus, did you have any follow-up to that?
Just whenever we get that notification, no results were obtained, we immediately start working with the laboratory, trying to find out how much extract we have, does it qualify? Everything just started immediately trying to get it in the queue to submit to FTG.
Okay, so on behalf of the SAKI TTA, we'd like to thank the presenters and also everyone for joining us for today's webinar. Have a good rest of the afternoon.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.